So in this talk, I'm going to analyze audiences 118 to 125 of John Paul II's Theology of the Body, which he titles The Ethical Problem. My talk is going to be broken into three parts. Part one has an A and a B. It seems to me that John Paul is doing two things in this section. A, he's teaching us something about the history of the contemporary debate about artificial birth control within the church. And B, he's setting out the parameters with which he's going to provide a resolution to that debate. In part two, I will present briefly a phenomenological analysis of embodiment of persons as it pertains to that resolution. And part three is a very short little story I sort of made up to make it concrete. So part 1A. We all know at the time of Humanae Vitae, technology had made artificial birth control widely accessible and inexpensive. And so Catholics wanted to know, can we use this in marriage or not? And Humanae Vitae answered the question there at 118.2. It's a quote from Humanae Vitae with the famous quote that we all know. The Church teaches that each and every marriage act must remain through itself or open, or as Janet taught us yesterday, per se destinatus, to the transmission of life. That teaching, often set forth by the magisterium, is founded upon the inseparable connection willed by God and unable to be broken by man on his own initiative between the two meanings of the conjugal act, the unitive meaning and the procreative. So the Church answered the question that everybody wanted to know with the answer, no, you may not use artificial birth control, and this is the reason why. So in 118.3 there, John Paul sets out his first parameter. He says, the considerations I'm about to propose will refer particularly to the passage of the encyclical that deals with the two meanings of the conjugal act and their inseparable connection. I do not intend to present a commentary on the whole encyclical, but rather to explain one passage at greater depth. And that's the passage I just read to you. 118.6 there, it's a dense passage. He says, since the conjugal act at one and the same time deeply unites husband and wife, and together makes them able to generate new lives, and since the one as well as the other thing come about by its innermost structure, it follows, with the necessity proper to reason, logical necessity, that the human person should read at one and the same time the two meanings of the conjugal act, and also the inseparable connection between the two meanings of the conjugal act, end quote. So here he's giving a brief definition of the two meanings of conjugal union. It deeply unites husband and wife, that's the unitive. It makes them able to generate new lives, that's the procreative. And he continues, I'm sort of going to reread it. And since one as well as the other, each of the two meanings, comes about by its innermost structure, it follows with the necessity proper to reason that the human person should read at one and the same time the two meanings of the conjugal act and their inseparable connection. So this emphasis on reason and logical necessity is very interesting. I think he's doing that on purpose to refute one of the dissenting positions, which I'll explain in a minute. So Humanae Vitae came out in 1968, Gaudium et Spes in 1965, and both of them discussed the two meanings and their integral relation. But that discussion had been going on since the 1920s because of the work of Dietrich von Hildebrand. That two meanings language is a different way of speaking compared to magisterial documents before Casti Connubii, which is from 1930. That older language is the three ends of marriage. The first is the one primary end, which is the procreation and education of children, and then secondarily the two secondary ends, the mutual help and remedy for concupiscence. Okay? And in all the church documents on sexual relations and marriage that come after Casti Connubii, the church speaks in the two meanings way and not in the three ends way. And in my next talk, I'm going to give an explanation, the talk on Saturday, of the relation between those two ways of speaking, which is not one supplanting the other old way, but it does take some explaining to show how they relate. Today, I want to talk about the fact that once these two meanings became clear through, I would say, the work of Hildebrand, and then eventually worked their way into the church documents, three distinct views about the two meanings language emerged. Two of them are false and one is true. So I want to explain those. So the first interpretation of the two meanings language, this, for lack of a better term, is the is the view on the left within the church. All right, the new language of the two meanings made some thinkers conclude wrongly that artificial contraception is morally acceptable. Put simply, they held that talk of the unitive meaning of the conjugal act would open up the church to approving artificial birth control as morally legitimate. The basic idea was that since there are now two meanings of equal importance, then one of them, the unitive meaning, could bear the moral weight of the act, even if the other, procreative dimension, were not present. These thinkers bolstered their argument with the idea that there are many reasons for which the woman will not become pregnant during a specific conjugal act. For example, she could be already pregnant, or infertile, or postmenopausal, or in the infertile time of the month, or her husband could be infertile. In all of those cases, love can be present, the unitive meaning can be fulfilled. Based on this, they argued that now that we have this second meaning that is indeed present in all of those conjugal acts, and since the procreative dimension is not biologically present, they said, let's just add one more case to the list given above for which the woman will not become pregnant in a specific conjugal act, artificial birth control. And then let the unitive meaning be the factor to make the conjugal act morally good in that case too. Now that's false. There's something radically different about artificial birth control than those other situations, which we're going to talk about. That is how that group argued. They were pleased with the new language, you could say, of the two meanings because they thought it opened the door to contraception in just the way outlined. They figured it was only a matter of waiting for the official pronouncements of the church to catch up with the new understanding, but they thought it would happen. So that's the first interpretation, and it's false, and it needs to be answered. All right, the second interpretation is, you could say, for lack of a better term, on the right within the church. All right. So because the argument just outlined in the first interpretation sounds quite strong, many Catholics faithful to church's moral teaching developed what I'm calling the second of three interpretations about the two meanings language. This second interpretation holds that the introduction of the two meanings language was an error for two reasons. Because it is different than the three ends language, and because the two meanings are not placed in a hierarchical order. And actually, if you look in the documents like the Catechism or the 1983 Code or Gaudium et Spes or Humanae Vitae, wherever they appear, actually the unitive comes first and the procreative comes second in every sentence. But it's not a hierarchy, but that's, I don't know. It's curious why they... Okay, so this second interpretation said that the two meanings language contradicted the former way of speaking of the three traditional ends ranked hierarchically. The point I want to make now is that this second interpretation holds that the two meanings language should never have been introduced, and they attribute to that change in language the reason why so many married Catholics use contraception now. They therefore want to expunge the two meanings language from official church documents and revert back to the three ends language exclusively. This second interpretation of the two meanings language seems like the extreme opposite of the first interpretation because the first accepts the two meanings language and this one rejects them. But in fact, these two interpretations are not opposites, they are identical. It often happens that if you look carefully at two views that are extreme opposites in their conclusions, they share an identical motivating premise. So I mean that these two views share one identical premise, which is they both hold that it follows logically and by necessity from the two meanings language that contraception is morally acceptable. The first and second interpretations of the two meanings language are in full agreement on that premise. In that sense, we can call them identical positions. It's just that they draw opposite conclusions about what to do from the shared premise. The first interpretation wants to go from that premise to rewriting the moral teachings of the church to allow contraception, and they are happy about the two meanings because they think that follows. But the second interpretation wants to go back to the three ends language and delete the two meanings language so as not to have to change the moral conclusion of the church, which they think follows from it. And I think maybe that's why in 118.6 here, John Paul says, with the necessity proper to reason and logical necessity, it follows if you reread the language of the body, that contraception is wrong. And these people are saying it follows logically that contraception is right. Okay. Before coming to the third interpretation, which will be the correct interpretation, and the one I'm arguing that John Paul is proposing in Theology of the Body, I would like to make one more distinction, and that is just to point out that for a number of reasons there was an explosion of use of contraception and sterilization among Catholics in the 1960s, and sadly to this very day. But there is a distinction between what historically actually happened on the one hand and the truth about the human person and morality on the other. For a set of reasons, the first interpretation above, sadly, is the one that held sway among bishops, priests, and the laity from the time it was developed until now. Not, of course, among all Catholics, but a strong majority. One may not conclude, however, from this historical fact that the two meanings language is flawed, or that by its inner logic it opens the door to contraception. Rather, we should conclude two other things. A, the two meanings language were misused by dissenting theologians to contradict church teaching and mislead the faithful, and the two meanings language as yet needed to be fully explained to the faithful and, I would say, to the clergy. And much work has been done in that regard, and this conference is a great addition to that work. But much still needs to be done, especially by way of disseminating. And something I've often thought is that although the dissent was flagrant back then, I think sometimes back then, with respect to many of the faithful and clergy, they didn't know how to explain the teaching like we do now. So maybe we can cut them a little bit of a break there. But now we can actually explain it deeply because of this, especially this personalist edition. So, and that's, by the way, something, if you look in Donum Vitae, which is one of the church documents on beginning of life issues, there's a couple passages in there that are quite striking. These church documents, one of the gifts of the magisterium, the way I would put it, is we get to get clear-cut answers to hard ethical questions that are burning in the culture, like Humanae. We already knew the answer, but Humanae Vitae just said no. And in Donum Vitae, they do that with a lot of different forms of helping people become pregnant again, distinguishing who are having trouble, distinguishing between replacing the conjugal act or assisting it. And morally illegitimate, legitimate, they list them all. And in there it says, this document, Donum Vitae, is not meant to halt reflection, but rather to spur further reflection. It's very interesting, and you're saying, wait a minute, why? You just told us all the answers. What else is there to reflect about? And then in the conclusion of Donum Vitae, it gives us the answer. I'm paraphrasing, but it says, we issue a call to moral theologians and philosophers to work out the reasons based on a valid anthropology to explain them to the faithful so they can understand them for themselves and then find a certain joy in living according to them because they understand the reasons for the moral conclusions themselves, and it becomes then like a joy in striving to live according to them. So that's why Donum Vitae and Humanae Vitae call for further reflection. There's all these beautiful little passages in those documents about love and the meaning of life and so forth, but we have to flesh them out in conferences like this so people can interiorize the reasons why they're good. I don't know if you ever noticed that Humanae Vitae, the theme of it, I think, is happiness. In the opening paragraph and the closing, he talks about the word happiness, and he says, I want couples and families to be happy, and they can only be happy if they live according to this. And so that explanation is what adds to that ability to be happy. Okay, so the third position, which I've actually expressed, if you want to turn back over to the front of the page, it says 2 there, number 2, the big paragraph, because I have the first 2 as A and B. But so this is the third position. I tried to encapsulate it in a paragraph. The two meanings approach represents a genuine case of development of doctrine and the hermeneutic of renewal or continuity. That's a Benedict phrase. And does add something new, but it does not alter the hierarchical relationship between the 3 traditional ends among each other. While the misinterpretation of the two meanings language has unfortunately led to the widespread use of contraception in Catholic marriages, the solution to that sad fact is to express the correct interpretation. This correct interpretation involves a rereading of many dimensions of love, personhood, the body, and marriage. And this rereading gives a new expression to the anthropological foundations of the norm against artificial birth control, confirming its truth and deepening our understanding of its goodness. And this new expression is an example of the type of dialogue that Benedict talks about at the top of the page. I may not read this, but there it's very beautiful from Benedict, and he talks about people today want to have they desire fullness, and we need to take that sincerely, that desire for fullness. You know, I don't know if like maybe a long time ago people said, oh, because Father said so, which is good if it's a trustable priest. You can do that and find joy. But now I think in general people want reasons for themselves, and that's good. And so that's why we and clergy and laity need to be able to actually give those reasons, so they say, oh, I never thought of it that way. Maybe I will strive to live like this. It does seem to be a source of fulfillment and happiness. Okay. Okay, so that's what he's doing, I think, in audiences 118 to 125, setting out his parameters within which he's going to refute the false premise held by those first two views above. He wants to show the true meaning of the two meanings language, and in so doing, reveal the moral wrongness of contraception and deepen our understanding and happiness. Okay, I said all this. Okay. So, you know, historically, I said I'm going to try to flesh that out a little bit more on Saturday, but John Paul knew that the publication of Humanae Vitae was like a flashpoint in church history, and all those fights happened that I alluded to with the two first interpretations. And I think one way to understand the text of Theology of the Body is he just decided to like transcend or step outside of that mayhem in an utterly unique way. And that seems to have been his calling, you could say, his special calling. And so his central concern in Theology of the Body is to explain Humanae Vitae, but he knew it would take a lot of study of Scripture and philosophy and theology. It's a dense text, but it's sort of like he's like, okay, you guys are fighting. I'm going to do this work that we're supposed to be doing of explaining, and then give us this, and now we have to unpack it and use it to explain it to other people. So that's what the text is. It's a deep meditation on the meaning of the body from Scripture and philosophy and theology and philology. Okay, so now this handout that you have, I just want to do maybe two more things quickly, maybe speak a little more freely. I'm not going to go through every single part of it because it's a lot, but you could in principle use this as a teaching tool for yourself. So if you look, when you're teaching, if you look on the front page, I noticed that there are these sets of two terms in these passages that sort of go together, like norm and reason for the norm. So the norm is this is prohibited, and then the reason for it. And then unitive and procreative I've already spoken about. Then anthropology and ethics. So anthropology is understanding what the meaning of an embodied human person is, and then ethics, your ethics flows from your anthropology. Okay, so analysis of the norm and pastoral approach. And that, when you read it, you probably noticed, and someone was talking to me about this, he keeps saying that Humanae Vitae is a pastoral document, and so Vatican II is a pastoral ecumenical council, like the Fourth Lateran Council was too, but not just a dogmatic one. And so he's very keen on saying in many of the passages that I've outlined. So what I've done in the handout is, in object and subject, I went a little bit more in depth on those terms in my workshop. So what I've done here with the handout is grab passages from this section where he shows the relationship between these sets of two terms. The norm is an obligation, you see there, but he wants to explain the reasons behind it. Unitive and procreative I talked about. And then maybe look down at 120.3. One could dwell for a long time on the analysis of the norm itself, but the character of both documents leads rather to the reflections that are, at least indirectly, pastoral. And Gaudium et Spes, in fact, Gaudium et Spes is a pastoral constitution. With all of its doctrinal value, Humanae Vitae tends to have the same orientation. So that's what's going on in the handout, where he's setting out his parameters. So if you now turn to the part where if it's page 3, where it says subjectivity and contemporary philosophical anthropology. So up until that part of my handout, I've given you quotes to explain those sets of two terms, and you can read them later. I think I've given enough now for you to grasp what they do. And what I want to do now, before the Q&A, is, and I'm going to go a little bit outside of John Paul's text, but I want to take up the question of embodiment a little bit, building on what's been said before in the seminar so far by Dr. Crosby and Dr. Frederica and Dr. Smith, and try to apply it a little bit to this idea of explaining to people the reasons for this teaching, which can give them a certain happiness in striving to live according to them. So in Theology of the Body, he says things like, you are your body, and the invisible determines you more than the visible, and the body expresses the person. Okay, so, and actually this is interesting. We've been talking about dualism, and if you have dualism about the divine being, like the Manichaeans, there's one bad God and one good God, and one creates the bad stuff, one creates the good stuff. And Augustine, he had to refute that by arguing for monotheism after he converted, 2 down to 1. But when you talk about body-soul dualism, dualism two, it's from the word for two. Strictly speaking, the problem with dualism in the body-soul question isn't two-ness like it is in the divine dualism. It's the dualism in the body-soul question is when you have positions which elevate one of the two principles in us and denigrate the other. So the solution to the dualism in the body-soul question isn't to get from 2 down to 1. It's to show the beautiful union and intimate union of the two principles, body and spirit, in the one person. Okay? So when John Paul says, you are your body, that's what materialists say, who deny that there's a soul. But he doesn't, obviously, he's the Pope. He can't deny the soul. So why does he say you are your body? The reason is because he's trying to find language to express accurately, which is really what philosophy is. It's just letting reality reveal itself to you as clearly as possible, and then you try to put into language as accurately as possible what you've seen. And some things are hard to put into words. And one of those is the intimate union of the body-soul union. And so when he says you are your body, he's not denying the soul. He's trying to find language to get across the idea of the intimacy of the body-soul union. So maybe he's willing to risk a little bit of a misinterpretation to get a strong language to show the intimacy of the connection between them. So what I do sometimes in my classes, you see that list of 6 concrete examples. I try to bring to evidence for people in simple ways their own experience of their own embodiment, and then at the end apply it to this teaching. So maybe I'll just do a couple of them. The sense perception is really interesting. It's quite deep. Augustine talks about this a lot, and then Ludger Herschel, in his book *The Reality of the Mind*, has a profound analysis of sense perception. But for now, we can just say, so what these six things are a phenomenological analysis of human experience, which, when pondered, gets you to realize the intimate union of your body and soul. So, okay. By the way, there are people who hold, and some of this was talked about, to what we could call separation dualism. They think there are two, like occasionalists, but we're arguing for unity dualism, you could say. So sense perception, and I'm drawing in part here on a book called Body and Soul, Leib und Seele. So I want to give credit where credit's due here, by Joseph Seifert. It's only in German, although there's a non-published English translation of parts of it. And he's drawing on many phenomenologists to bring these points out. Like hearing right now, the sense of hearing. I'm thinking right now meaningful thoughts. Hopefully they're meaningful, and those are not physical. And then I'm talking, teeth, sound waves, and then you have eardrums and bones in your ear. But then something utterly amazing happens. The meaning that I am thinking now you have, which is not physical. If there was a dog or a cat here, their eardrums would be vibrating too. But that meaning wouldn't be entering their mind. And so just that simple experience of sense perception, which is sort of mysteriously even inexplicable how it happens, shows one simple way that we are body-soul union. We can transcend ourselves meaningfully to the whole universe somehow via physical senses. The immediate presence of the person in the body, and there I say person, I got to be maybe a little careful. I mean the person is the body. So maybe I could have said the spirit in the body. But you know, a few points there, which was actually brought up, and like when Dr. Crosby said the quote about the feminist who said, God doesn't care what we do with each other's bodies, he only cares how we treat each other as persons. If you went up to her, which I don't recommend because we're all Christians, and slapped her in the face, and she got mad at you and you said, no, that's just your cheek in my hand, but I respect you as a person, she wouldn't accept that, obviously. Or if you gave her a warm, consoling hug, which would be nice, and she felt consoled in her soul, then of course, in those simpler examples, it's quite obvious that we're an intimate union of body and soul. And she, as Dr. Crosby pointed out, was using that to argue against the moral teachings about sexuality, which are even deeper than a hug. So obviously it should be more obvious, not... Okay. So I'm going through these more quickly than I do in my classes because we have to have some time for Q&A. But maybe we'll just skip to the fourth one. Human expression. This is quite striking that if you think, it's just utterly amazing that something like rudeness is not physical, or happiness, or joy. John Paul said once when he met Mother Teresa that he saw the meaning of Mother Teresa in her eyes. He said that. So, I mean, the point is, isn't it utterly amazing that things like the look in someone's eye, or their facial expression, or their face, or their tone of voice, or their posture, those are all physical things. They get to be that way because of what we think, feel, and will, which are all not physical things. It's quite striking. Your face, strictly speaking, isn't happy, but it is happy. Okay? So, or something like the slap or the hug, or if someone pats you on the back, like your father pats you on the back because he's proud of you, you did sports or something. If you think about the pat on the back, if you think about that experience, it's not a logical deduction. You don't say, okay, yes, I watched a movie once and someone scored a touchdown and someone else patted them on the back and that meant pride, so therefore this hand must mean pride. No. The pride, there's no deduction. Isn't it utterly amazing that the pride, which is spiritual, is immediately present in the pat? It's because of this intimate union of the body soul that we are, that is that way. So human expression is what makes empathy possible. It's that you can feel the feelings of another by reading the facial expression, which is right present in the, And that's immediate too, by the way. It doesn't mean that you can read everybody's soul just by looking at their face. And it doesn't mean people can't trick you. I just mean that when empathy happens, it happens like in this immediate way. Like you could have a friend, say, who you think they're having a very good day, and then it could be something as simple as like a quiver in their lip. And you're overwhelmed. They're sad. What is that? A quiver in their lip? It's a physical thing. But so empathy is immediate like that because of the body-soul union. It's not a deduction. You didn't see someone's lip quiver in a soap opera and conclude to. No, it's immediate. Okay, and that shows okay. Also, the uniqueness of persons gets expressed. It's somehow, everybody's laugh is unique. Sometimes that utter uniqueness of persons, or as Dr. Crosby calls their incommunicability, it's also one of those ineffable dimensions. You know it when you love somebody, the uniqueness of someone, but there's no words that can, maybe their name, but the essence of a person's uniqueness. There's no words. But so sometimes if you ask the students, well, why you love somebody, put it into words, they'll say, I think maybe because of the way they walk or the way they laugh. But that's because it's not strictly speaking the laugh or the walk. It's that the person is in some mysterious way uniquely present in their body, and that reveals the unique person to you. But since there's no words to express the person, you say the laugh. That shows also the close intimacy. So now here's my concluding point about the two imaginary couples. So sometimes you've heard this argument that says, okay, contraception is immoral because the conjugal union is a total gift of self. And so if you give your whole self but hold back your fertility, you haven't given your whole self, therefore it's wrong. Which is like a syllogistic way of making the argument. There's some percentage of yourself, and there's some truth to that. But it is true. But I don't think it's a personalist way of explaining the point. I think a personalist way of explaining the point could be based on this embodiment. We could add that same point, but make it a personalist argument. A seventh thing on here and say, I'm always a little bit full of trepidation going down this path because I'm going to say something about women. But if you compare the fertility as an embodied experiment of men and women, then what you notice is that with women, they have a more experiential awareness of their fertility because of their cycle, and we don't. Because of the whole monthly cycle, it's related to the body and the soul and the emotions and so forth. It's an integral part of her embodiment, more so than men. So once you get people to grasp this intimate union of body and soul, like I've just been trying to do, and then you bring in this point about fertility, then you can imagine, if a man says to his wife or fiancé, I love you, I want to know everything about you, including your fertility, and I want us to live our marriage in tune with that, if he says that, then that woman is going to feel affirmed in her body-soul unity and at a deep level of her being. But if he says, and maybe not this sentence, but asking the person to use contraception is saying this, if he says, your fertility is annoying me, could we please delete it? Then she's going, because of the embodiment of persons, at some level of her being, she has to experience that as a rejection of her whole personhood. And that knowledge about embodiment, and then that little story I just made up, also empowers the man to be able to love more deeply, like the first guy.